Welcome to DIY Guitar Making at Eric Schaefer Guitars, where I share my knowledge and experience as a professional acoustic guitar maker in order to promote the craft that we all love called lutherie. I've been thinking a lot about the relationship between perfection and efficiency lately, and I just wanted to share some thoughts on that. The students who take my hands-on workshop know that there are some tasks in the workshop that are just brutally tedious. Radiusing the fretboard over the body is definitely one of them. And I often hear students say, man, there's got to be an easier way to do this. And I'll say, yeah, there is, but it comes at a cost. For example, any kind of power sander, such as a random orbital sander, is not going to leave a surface truly flat like hand sanding will. So it makes sense to hand sand certain surfaces, like say in preparation for joinery, or say hand sanding the sides in preparation for cutting binding and purfling channels. Otherwise, you are compromising your results and you end up with either gaps in your neck joint or gaps in your binding channels. And often if you are taking shortcuts for the sake of efficiency in the early stages of the build, you don't see the consequences of those shortcuts until much later in the process, which then it can be hard to look back and attribute that problem to the actual source. And then it's just hard to figure out why you're even having that issue in the first place. And so I remember a time not long after I first got into guitar making when I was trying to solve efficiency problems before I had perfected a given process. Now I understand when I use the word perfect, in some cases perfect is an endlessly moving target. Like in the case of finishing, or certainly in the case of achieving tone. I don't know if anyone can say that they've achieved perfection in either finishing or achieving tone, but the pursuit of perfection in those cases keeps you moving in the right direction. Now on the flip side, there are steps in guitar making where you can reasonably reach, for all practical purposes, a state of perfection. In fact, I would say most steps in a build are like this. Let's take the example of installing binding and purfling. If there are reliably no gaps in your binding and purfling scheme, then you can reasonably say that you've perfected it. There's no amount of further consideration or alteration of your process that is going to make your binding less gappy if it is already gap-free. Of course, you can always challenge yourself by attempting a more complex binding and purfling scheme, but as it stands right now, your process is perfect. So anyway, what got me out of the rut that I was in when I was hopelessly pursuing both perfection and efficiency at the same time was when I gave up on efficiency and simply pursued perfection by whatever means. I stopped trying to do things the easy or efficient way, and I simply tried things the very hard way. And when I reached that state of reasonable perfection for all practical purposes that I just talked about, I would then look back on my process and reverse engineer the efficiencies back into it. And I wasn't consciously doing this at the time. I think I was just fed up, honestly, with making things that sucked, and I decided the only way to move forward was to try things the hard way, which eventually, through trying things the hard way, it yielded the results that I wanted, which then, with nothing else for my mind to pursue in terms of making the results better, my mind would naturally turn to improving the ease and efficiency of the process. It's only in retrospect that I realized that what I was doing was pursuing perfection regardless of efficiency and then reverse engineering the efficiency back into the process. We'll stick with binding and purfling again as an example. When I started out building, I had a hell of a time trying to figure out how to cut good, clean, and square binding and purfling channels. In fact, I struggled with this literally for years. Until eventually I gave up on the router setup that I was using and I began to cut my channels by hand with just a grommet and an 1/8" chisel. And it was hard and it was time consuming but with a little bit of practice, those channels were perfect. And then eventually, when I went back to a router setup held in a binding tower jig, it was obvious to me the mistakes that I was making before, because I now had a deeper and a more visceral understanding rather than simply a book understanding or conceptual understanding of what it takes to get those channels super square and clean and just perfect. And so nowadays I never use these tools to cut my binding channels. I use a router held in a binding tower jig, but the grommet and the 1/8 inch chisel were absolutely instrumental in me figuring out how to cut those channels well in that setup. So I just wanted to make this video to encourage people who are struggling with particular steps to try it the hard way. However, I do want to say that if you're new to guitar building, say on your first guitar, your second guitar, your third guitar, maybe even your fourth guitar, I would actually not take this advice. The reason is I actually do think there is a lot of value in simply plowing through, in a certain sense, that first, second, or third build, just to get a couple iterations of the build process down so you can understand the full scope of everything before you start really dialing in some of the concepts and pursuing the perfection that I'm talking about here. And by all means, I'm not saying that I've perfected or mastered this myself. This is all still a process for me as well, and will be for the rest of my life. I'll never stop learning and improving what I'm doing. The process, I believe, will simply just get more granular as time goes on and I start to focus in on more narrow concepts. And hopefully that's the way you approach your building too. So anyway, that's all I got for you today. I gotta go feed the cat. Bye. If you learned something here, please give this video a like and subscribe so you can be notified when I release a new DIY guitar making video every Friday. And if you want to really learn more, take one of my structured online courses at ericschaferguitars.com or register for a hands-on guitar building workshop here with me in Burnville, Pennsylvania.